Good morning, good afternoon. I don't think it's necessary to say good evening this time around. Ordinarily, I say all three at these webinars, but I think the geographic spread we have this time means I don't need to do it on this occasion. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the CPA webinar for speakers and presiding officers on COVID-19 and independent parliaments. My name is James Pennell. I'm the Programs Manager at the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, primarily responsible for multilateral engagements, and I'll be your moderator for this online seminar. I'm fortunate to be joined by my colleague Jack Hardcastle, who's also been instrumental in convening this webinar and is assisting with all technical issues. I'm sure all of us who've been on webinars know how vital a role that is. I'm delighted to be joined by an esteemed panel of speakers and presiding officers from across the Commonwealth, including the Honourable Anthony Rota, MP, Speaker of the House of Commons of Canada, and the current President of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, the Honourable Bridgid Annisette-George, Speaker of the House of Representatives of Trinidad and Tobago, the Right Honourable Dame Eleanor Laing, MP, Deputy Speaker of the House of Commons of the United Kingdom, and the Honourable Nontembeco Boyce, Speaker of the KwaZulu-Natal Legislature. I'd like to just highlight Madam Speaker Boyce's attendance. Thank you so much for stepping in at such short notice to assist with this webinar. And I'd also like to express condolences on behalf of the CPA for the sad passing of the former Deputy Speaker, Mluleke Ndobe, earlier this year. Our condolences to all in KwaZulu-Natal for that very sad development. We're also very fortunate to be hearing from Mr. Matthew Salick today, Head of Parliamentary Development at the CPA Secretariat, and author of the Model Law for Independent Parliaments, which we'll be including in our discussions today. You'll also be hearing from the CPA Secretary General, Mr. Stephen Twigg, at the conclusion of the webinar, and our sincerest thanks to Stephen for his kind attendance. I'd like to say how delighted we are to be hosting this programme specifically aimed at speakers from across the Commonwealth. Presiding officers are one of our key stakeholders and partners in delivering on our commitments to identifying benchmarks of good governance and promoting parliamentary practice and procedure. It's not often that we're able to convene such gatherings, so today marks a very special occasion and one which we hope to continue replicating at future events with speakers and presiding officers. This is actually the second webinar for speakers and presiding officers, following another webinar last month for the other regions of the CPA, not in attendance here today. The CPA, we're also looking to deliver capacity building to presiding officers through the delivery of our Parliamentary Academy, which I should mention, which will include a course for speakers, and will of course keep all branches aware of the progress on these courses and the wider Parliamentary Academy. We expect it'll be of great benefit to a great many of our members. I'd also like to acknowledge the generous presence and the kind presence of the Right Honourable Rebecca Kadaga, Speaker of the Parliament of Uganda, who has joined us in the audience today. She's a great friend of the CPA, having formerly been President of the CPA and also host of the last CPC last year, and also in particular her great work with the Commonwealth Women Parliamentarians Network, having previously been chairperson of that particular network. I'm conscious of time and I'm eager to get the webinar started, so I just have a few housekeeping points. I'd like to just remind all speakers and attendees that this webinar is being recorded. However, it's not being live streamed. If anybody wishes to request a part of this webinar not be included in the final recording, please do let us know and advise accordingly. I think I'm getting a little bit of feedback at the moment, so if everyone could just stay on mute if they're not speaking, that'd be most appreciated. And the CPA will look to distribute this recording online. So again, if you have any concerns about the recording and anything you'd like to be removed, please do let us know and we'll do what we can. Attendees do not have the ability to unmute or turn their cameras on. However, there will be an opportunity to interact and make contributions in the second part of this session when we will enter a Q&A. If you'd like to pose a question to the panel during the Q&A, please raise your virtual hand. You should see a hand symbol on your screens whilst in Zoom. So please do use that should you wish to ask a question, or alternatively, you can write your questions in the chat. And should you wish, in the chat function, you can request that your question remains anonymous, should you wish. When asking questions, we do ask that your questions are in fact questions and are no longer than 15 seconds. Should you wish to share extensive information from your own jurisdiction or organization on the work you've done that's sort of relevant to this seminar, please do share it with us. We'll be happy to distribute it long form So you will have an avenue to share information from your own jurisdictions. We're more than happy to facilitate that. And finally, please feel free to chat with your fellow attendees using the chat function. It's what it's there for. We want a lively dialogue both in the chat and during the Q&A. And if you have any technical issues, please also use the chat function. And Jack and also I will aim to help you in any way that we can. Now that all of the preliminaries are out the way, and without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to invite our first panelist to speak, the Honourable Anthony Rota, Speaker of the House of Commons of Canada and the current CPA President. Honourable Rota, the floor is yours. I think you may be on mute, Honourable Speaker.
Let's try that again then. Thank you very much, James. And good morning and afternoon to all of you, depending on which one qualifies this morning in Canada. Honourable speakers and presiding officers of the Commonwealth, it's a pleasure to speak with you today on this very important topic, COVID-19 in independent parliaments. Je suis très content d'être de votre même si c'est une façon virtuelle. The subject we address today is a timely one, and one that will certainly be discussed for years to come. Much of the work we do is enriched by human interaction, but to stem the spread of the coronavirus, we have been forced to remodel our parliamentary systems and rethink the way we conduct business. We have had to limit in-person interactions, and many of our old practices have been relegated to the past. Still, we have learned a number of lessons, and as we navigate uncharted territory, more experiences lie ahead. We are now living in a new and different normal, and I have no doubt that we have the capacity to emerge from this stronger and more resilient than ever. Today, I will focus on how the Parliament of Canada fulfilled its responsibilities during its initial response to COVID-19 pandemic. Aujourd'hui, je vais me pencher sur les mesures prises par le Parlement du Canada pour continuer son travail durant les premières semaines de la pandémie. Like many parliaments in the Commonwealth, ours faced unprecedented disruptions following the declaration of COVID-19 pandemic. From the outset, Canadian parliamentarians recognized the seriousness of public health crisis. Because so many of us travel across the country to participate in parliamentary proceedings, it quickly became clear that if we continued to do so, we would pose a certain health risk to our families, friends, colleagues, and communities. To prevent the spread of COVID-19, we unanimously made the difficult decision to temporarily suspend Parliament. The legislative agenda was completely upended. Association work was temporarily cancelled. Committee work came to a halt. Parliamentary proceedings were adjourned, and legislation could no longer be forwarded, or could no longer move forward. This action not only prevented Canadian parliamentarians from becoming COVID-19 vectors in the House, it also gave the government an opportunity to mount a response and help Canadians weather the pandemic. Of course, suspending Parliament poses a number of challenges and raised important questions. Without a sitting legislature, how could parliamentarians fulfill their oversight functions? How could they scrutinize the government's efforts to ensure the needs of all Canadians were being addressed? How would parliamentarians give a voice to those whose needs were not being met? More importantly, how could the Parliament of Canada preserve the public's confidence? After all, a functioning independent parliament capable of holding the government to account is a defining feature of a healthy democracy. Several factors have contributed to the Parliament of Canada's success through the pandemic. Firstly, Canada has a strong independent legislature. The decision to suspend Parliament was not made by the government, it was decided unanimously by all parliamentarians. In making this decision, there was also a strong understanding that it was a temporary measure. As such, parliamentary personnel were asked to prepare for a safe and prompt return of Parliament. This meant incorporating new technologies and adapting existing rules to accommodate the new reality. Secondly, the government required the opposition's support to pass emergency legislation expeditiously. As such, critical lines of communications were swiftly established between party leaders and among party members. Before Parliament was recalled to adopt emergency relief legislation implemented to address the needs of Canadians during the pandemic, the government sought and took into account input from the opposition. Thirdly, though Parliament was suspended and parliamentarians were encouraged to work from home, they retained access to all resources that they needed to continue their functions. This included access to their staff, both on Parliament Hill and in their constituency office, as well as access to parliamentary resources, including clerks and the library's research services. These three elements not only contributed to a successful parliamentary response, they also showed the public that while Parliament was suspended, it could continue to work on behalf of the people of Canada. While the Canadian Parliament's initial response was to suspend its session, measures have been adopted to facilitate full resumption of Parliament proceedings, albeit a modified one. Our current model allows for hybrid meetings, both in committees and in the House of Commons chamber. These meetings permit members to participate either by video conference or in person. Of course, those participating in person are required to respect public health guidelines. Canadian parliamentarians are fortunate to have a strong parliamentary tradition with laws that protect Parliament's independence from the government. Nous, les parlementaires canadiens, sommes reconnaissants de notre forte tradition parlementaire et de nos lois qui protègent l'indépendance du gouvernement. Of course, we are all anxious for the return to normal, whatever that normal may be. Until then, however, the Parliament of Canada continues to adjust to these new realities while asserting its independence. Thank you for inviting me to speak, and I look forward to a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Honourable Rota. Thank you so much for your presentation, highlighting the challenges and questions of a suspended Parliament, and absolutely the idea of how to preserve public trust in the institution during such a difficult time is absolutely a key consideration at these times, and very interesting to hear about the hybrid approach to some of your meetings. So thank you so much. It now gives me great pleasure to hand over to the Honourable Bridgid Annisette-George, Speaker of the House of Representatives of Trinidad and Tobago. Madam Speaker, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Mr. Pinnell, and good morning to the esteemed panelists. Good morning to the representatives of the CPA. Good morning to all my fellow presiding officers, speakers, senators of the presiding officers of the Senate, and all other presiding officers. It is my extreme pleasure to be part of this panel to share with you the experience of Trinidad and Tobago's Parliament and how we have adapted to COVID-19. While the initial response to the pandemic worldwide was one of shutting down, our objective was one of maintaining our Parliament's sustainability. And I believe that it is fair to say that Parliament was sufficiently responsive to ensure that it was able to discharge its budgetary, legislative, oversight, and representative functions with minimal interruption, although this required a fair bit of modification. And how did we achieve that? And I would say it was our focus. We built our focus and our response on 4 pillars, 4 Ps, which was prevention, preparedness, public health and safety, parliamentary leadership, which we applied to our staff and our plant. Our plant comprises what we now call the Parliament Complex, and it's made up of our historic Red House, which we returned to in January of this year, and a companion building. We looked at the various aspects to make Parliament sustainable. So we applied the 4 Ps to facilities management. And of course, all the public health measures of increased sanitization, we stopped tours of the Parliament. And in fact, from December 2020, we'd be doing virtual tours. We restricted the entry of non-essential visitors to the Parliamentary complex. We instituted temperature screening on entry, and of course, mandatory use of the mask throughout the complex. We applied it to our human resource, and it was people-centered. So we combined the approaches of work from home arrangements, rostering of staff, shift work, staggering of work hours. And of course, we instituted access protocols for the staff. We also tried to maintain our staff wellness so that we provided counseling services for our staff. We established a virtual gym doing yoga, aerobics, weight training, nutrition. Then we looked at our strategic management and we employed ICT. We enhanced our own dedicated iCloud, which is PAL Cloud, to increase capabilities to utilize shared folders and files externally. We established virtual meetings among staff and managers via Zoom and Teams, and we also established WhatsApp groups amongst teams. As far as our parliamentarians, of course, were mandated to use masks throughout the complex. We provided the masks and gloves if necessary. Parliamentarians were also subjected to mandatory screening. We provided public health protocols. We reconfigured our chamber to allow for social distancing. Now, our parliament was never suspended and it did not go virtual. So that as far as all our restrictions was really to help contain the pandemic being spread within the parliament. So we reduced the speaking times by consent. We forwent the 4:30 suspension. We established protocols for a division, and there was also agreement on a limited number of members sitting in the chamber while maintaining the quorum and also the balance of the parties. Throughout the parliamentary complex, other members were accommodated with screens and television sets to follow the proceedings live. How have we performed? Has this impeded us? And I think some of the statistics helps to show. So when I compare the period March to July 20, which was really the initial impact of the pandemic, we had in March to July 2019, there were 20 sittings of the House, when compared to March to July 2020, 18 sittings. Of the Senate, in the period March to July 2019, there were 21 sittings of the Senate. In the same period, March to July 2020, we had 23 sittings of the Senate. We were able to commence our 12th Parliament on the 28th of August 2020, that was following our general elections in August of 2020. And in fact, on the occasion of the opening, there was the first sitting of the House of Representatives, which followed later that day, where we dealt with public health regulations to deal with the pandemic. So far, as of to date, we have had 8 sittings of the House of Representatives, and our next sitting is as early as next Friday, which is Friday the 27th, where we'll be dealing with Private Members' Day. Our Senate has had 6 sittings thus far, and they had their Private Members' Day on the 17th of November. So, and the usual business of Parliament is conducted, the usual items. So there have been questions on notice, there have been urgent matters, there have been matters on the adjournment. And in fact, as recently as the last sitting of the House, there was Prime Minister's questions. We've maintained our live coverage on our dedicated television and radio channels, and that helps to deal with the issue that was created by restricting visitors to the parliamentary complex and also restricting the number of media houses. We've continued with our accountability and oversight functions. In fact, we began an inquiry into the preparedness of our public authorities to combat COVID-19 as early as January of 2020, before COVID-19 even hit our shores, and we've had 2 public inquiries. Our committees continue to meet virtually, and last week, a week ago, we convened 19 joint select committees in this new parliament, and of those 19 joint select committees, 3 are dealing with bills which are to be reported on by the 31st of December 2020. So that I think we've been doing our work. We've done our legislative measures. Importantly, we've done our budget. Our budget statement was read on the 5th of October 2020. The budget debate was completed in the House of Representatives on the 22nd of October. We've had our Standing Finance Committee, which allowed the House of Representatives to interrogate the 41 heads of expenditure. The budget was passed in the Senate on the 26th of October 2020. And the budget has provided a total allocation of $41.3 billion with a focus on post-COVID recovery. We've also continued our youth engagement. So annually, we host a youth parliamentary debate in the parliamentary chamber. It's usually held towards the last week in November, or the first week in December. This year, we're doing it virtually, and it will be done on the 9th of December. So I would say that while the world has changed because of the pandemic, it was no reason for us to change our usual business in which we were involved for the advancement of the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, for your excellent contributions, and glad to hear that the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago is able to function, if not completely as normal, as close to it as possible. And also very interesting to hear about the idea of maintaining staff wellness in the way that you have, not just sort of the purely medical, but also the sort of more social and psychological. So it's very, very interesting to hear that, and very glad to hear that you're able to have your budget debate. So excellent to hear what's happening in Trinidad and Tobago. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce the Right Honourable Dame Eleanor Laing, Deputy Speaker of the House of Commons of the United Kingdom. We're especially grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker, for your stepping in at very short notice. I know there was a change of schedules in Westminster, so we're very, very grateful that you've agreed to join us at such short notice. Madam Deputy Speaker, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a lovely surprise for me to be with you this afternoon, as I had no idea that such an interesting session was going on. But Mr. Speaker Hoyle sends his apologies. We are having quite a busy time here right now, as I'm sure you are in all of your parliaments. Mr. Speaker Hall was looking forward to meeting you all this afternoon, virtually meeting you all this afternoon, but sadly he hasn't been able to do so. And one of the reasons is because although Speaker Annisette-George has just said rightly how pleased you are there in Trinidad and Tobago to have had your budget debates and your budget, etc. We are right in the middle now of the Chancellor delivering the autumn spending review. And so Mr. Speaker has been in the chair for most of the day and has now had to deal with something else. So that's one of the reasons why he isn't here, but I'm delighted to be here instead. And I'm so pleased to see my my former colleague and longtime friend, Stephen Twigg, looking after the CPA. It's great to see you, Stephen. I bet you're having great fun doing the CPA, a lot more than you would have had if you'd continued in Parliament. But that's not a question I'm going to ask. the presentations that have already been given by the two speakers before me set out very much the same sort of attitude that we have taken in the UK Parliament, and the sort of things that we have done to allow Parliament to continue to function. We took the view, and the government took the view right at the beginning of the pandemic, that it was vitally important that we uphold our democratic system, that Parliament continues to hold the government to account, and all the more so because, as Speaker Annisette-George said, and I think Speaker Rota said as well, we were passing very, very rigorous emergency legislation. We in the UK Parliament have been taking steps these last 8 months to restrict the freedom of the British people to an extent that it has never been restricted before. I think I really mean never, certainly not for centuries, certainly not in living memory, but actually never. And if you are bringing in such sweepingly enormous powers to affect the lives of every single person in the UK, it's important that Parliament is seen to hold the government to account when that's being done. We did it initially, as Speaker Rota said, in Canada, by agreement between the opposition parties and the government. Everybody cooperated, knowing that we were in an unprecedented situation. We then proceeded not to suspend Parliament, but to have our normal Easter recess, which gave us a couple of weeks of respite when practical measures could be put in place. And Mr. Speaker Hoyle, with the agreement of the government, the opposition, the whip's offices, the unions and other representatives of those who are involved in Parliament, brought in practical measures and also procedural measures, which would allow us to go on functioning while protecting the health and potential health of people who work here. We normally have, in the Palace of Westminster, we normally have several thousand people. And of course, we're also a tourist attraction. So hundreds and hundreds of people in normal times pass through this building on a daily basis. Obviously, one of the first things that had to happen was to stop the tourists and to stop other visitors. But we have managed to keep the core functions going throughout. The sad thing is, as others have said, about the loss of human interaction and the loss of spontaneity in our debates. But we have taken the view, and I believe that it has worked, that it's better to have sort of 70% of Parliament working rather than have Parliament stop altogether or seize up or be completely different. So what we've done from a practical point of view is, you know, our debating chamber is a very large space, and normally it takes over 400 members when it's absolutely packed full. Now we can have about 50 members in there. We have 10 enormous screens. We took the, I didn't explain, we took the decision to have hybrid proceedings, where some people have been able to participate from the chamber and in committees and in the normal way, fairly normal way in this building. And some have had to participate by technological means. We had a big debate yesterday about how that should go in the future, and I can't tell you what the answer is to that yet because no decision has yet been taken. But as of now, we're operating virtual proceedings in questions and statements and urgent questions, so that members can choose to come in by screen rather than in person. But we had that hybrid system for the first 6 months of the pandemic, but we have now gone on to having a fairly normal system as far as debates are concerned. But there is some discussion going on as to whether people who are shielding and who, for good reason, simply cannot come to Westminster should be able to also to participate in debates as well as in questions and statements. So to facilitate the safety of everyone in this building, not just members of Parliament, but the thousands and thousands of people who work here to support us, we have 10 screens installed in the chamber. We have some perspex screens set up to protect the sergeant at arms and the clerks and the speaker's secretary. It's nothing at the moment to protect the speaker. We just have to say while sitting in the chair, please don't come right up to me and talk to me. Do you find that too, other speakers? That whereas social distancing is being very well observed, and we have the chamber set out so that only 41 people can actually participate to speak and about 50 people can be there at a time. They are strictly marked out seats where people can and can't sit, which are clearly 2 meters or more apart. And our observation of social distancing can be carefully scrutinized and seen so that people can have confidence in the way that we're doing things. I have to say that keeping people away from the speaker's chair is sometimes a little bit difficult, because they always want to come and ask you questions, don't they? Like, when am I going to be called? How long is this debate going to go on for? And we have to say, go away, don't come so close to me. But generally, members of Parliament are reasonably well behaved. And so I've described the chamber to you. We have markings on the floor to encourage people when they are going to vote to go through the lobby and to stay 2 meters apart. And we have new pass readers installed in the voting lobbies, so that instead of going through a narrow passage and giving the clerk your name, people are able to just touch their pass on a reader, so that the interaction between the clerks and members of Parliament is very considerably restricted. We're also very careful to have the chamber cleaned on an ongoing basis, because as members, even as ministers and shadow ministers stand at the dispatch box, they hold on to the dispatch box. Stephen, you remember what it's like when you're in front of the dispatch box, you put your hands on it. And that's the kind of thing that the health and safety people have told us we must be careful of. And therefore, after each debate or question session, we suspend the House for 3 minutes, and someone comes in with sanitizing equipment and cleans the dispatch box and all around there. So we are terribly, terribly careful about it. And you may have noticed that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has not been able to attend the House for the last 2 weeks. Today, he did Prime Minister's questions for the second time via a Zoom link from 10 Downing Street, because he was in the company of someone 2 weeks ago who later proved to have contracted the virus. Therefore, he had to obey the rules and self-isolate for 14 days. And as you all know, he himself suffered from the virus in the early days of the pandemic. And he has been setting an extremely good example about what you have to do in these situations. Some people said, oh, don't be ridiculous, the Prime Minister can come into the House of Commons. But of course he couldn't. He couldn't possibly. he didn't know whether he was carrying the virus, so he couldn't come in here and take the risk of infecting the rest of us. And we are acutely aware, as I'm sure you are, of what happens at the end of every week is that members leave Westminster, leave London, and go to every part of the country. So if we took any risks here at Westminster, we would risk spreading the virus everywhere. And we've been very, very careful about that. We've told most staff, most members of staff.
Madam Deputy Speaker, you just have 1 minute remaining, if you could.
Yep, I only need 1 minute. I shall conclude.
Perfect.
We've been very careful to tell staff to work from home where they possibly can. We now require everyone moving around the estate to wear masks. We have hand sanitizers everywhere. The eating venue, at the moment, all social venues are closed, but places which provide food, which we have to have, are set out with chairs at 2 meters distance. And we've developed our own track and trace system with the help of Public Health England. One of the most important things we've done is to introduce proxy voting, so that instead of having 600 or more members of Parliament squashing together to go through to vote, we have reduced that so that only about 200 members of Parliament will actually vote at any one time, and the other 400 and more have given their proxy to someone else so that they don't have to be here in person during a division. We hope that we have made sure that democracy continues and is seen to continue while we keep everybody safe on the estate. And I'm delighted to hear what other parliaments are doing. And it seems that we have all developed very similar systems. I look forward to hearing what other people have done and what questions you have. Thank you.
Many thanks, Madam Deputy Speaker, for your contributions. And again, thank you so much for stepping in at such short notice. And I think the point you made near the start about how at the best of times it's important for Parliament to hold government to account, but especially when you're passing legislation that's, if it's the right term, curtailing freedoms that we sort of take for granted, that's even more important then. I think that's a very important point to make, and thank you for making it. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce the Honourable Nontembeko Ndabeko Boyce, Speaker of the KwaZulu-Natal Legislature. Madam Speaker, I know that you've been having a few issues with the audio. I trust they've been resolved now, and if they have, you have the floor. So, Madam Speaker, the floor is all yours.
Have they been resolved, James? Oh, thank you. Greetings, James, fellow panelists, and to all that are joining us. It's a pleasure for me to be part of this panel. But I think I must start where you started, James, to appreciate the support that we have received from the Secretariat Office during the time that we have the bereavement of the Deputy Speaker as the KwaZulu-Natal Legislature, as well as the family of the late Deputy Speaker, because we have sent the condolences letter to them. They really appreciated that. Coming now to how did we respond? Firstly, KwaZulu-Natal is a provincial legislature, so our response might be a little bit different to what has been put forward because the other colleagues and speakers are speakers of parliament. So in South Africa, we are one of the legislatures, and when we are having an approach would also be linked to the general approach that we have at a national level. When the news broke of the COVID-19 in South Africa, the first person was from our own province. And when those news broke, we were on the day that we were tabling the provincial budget. So you should start thinking that how we were affected, because we were just about to adopt our own appropriation bill and deal with all the appropriation related business of the institution. But also it was at the time that we were going to head to the end of the financial year, which was the 31st of March. So it came at that particular time, and all our responses were structured such that we must not fail to meet our constitutional mandate when it comes to, amongst many things that the legislature is expected to, but the ones that were before us was to also deal with appropriations and also deal with the issue of our financial accountability as an institution. We started as a legislature that is not yet fully a parliament. We were moving, we are still in the migration process, moving towards a parliament. Whilst I know that most colleagues were already at that level, when we had to do this, we had to do scenario planning. The EXCO, that is the administrative EXCO, together with the leadership at the office of the presiding officers and the office of the chief whips, have to sit down and do scenario planning. And we put down the plans, and the plans that we had were to respond, one, on whether the lockdown was going to be short term, or what do we do if the lockdown is long term. So right from the onset, we planned for those eventualities. We also had to migrate our environment to ensure that the environment is going to be able, the physical environment is going to be able to deal or accommodate any changes, like installation of fog booths, installation of booths for sanitization for members inside and the staff, and also buildings that need to be made to work to avoid touch, like we had to migrate to biometrics and at a certain time, but now we had to move back to using the card so that we do not really have a contact, a physical contact with the buildings. That we did, but the big one, the rules of the legislature were not necessarily responding or have anticipated a period that we have to work not physically present in the institution. During the break time that we were given, the lockdown, before the announcement of the lockdown level 5, before, at the total lockdown that was first announced, we started to put these scenario plans into place, and we started to respond. We started to respond with ensuring that how do we make our rules allow us to work virtually, because the rules were not allowing us to work virtually. We started to have engagements between parties, opposition parties within the legislature. And we were also guided by what was taken as a recommendations and guidelines from the sector at a national level. How do we internalize and bring them to KwaZulu-Natal practically? How do we do what we have agreed on at a national level? We updated the rules. And there was great cooperation amongst parties to include the issue of virtual parliaments, but also to define the presence in a sitting, because our own rules were saying that you must be physically present. Now we had to speak to that, but also giving effect amongst the rules. There is a rule that sometimes a member can be given an opportunity, can give another member an opportunity to present their motion if they are absent by any reason. But now there was another reality that we had not had envisaged. When we are fully virtual, there can be issues of network connectivity. So now we had to also build in that, what if technology in any instance and access to the legislature program is hindered. So we did that in the period that we had no movement in South Africa, and at the period that as a legislature we have decided to plan and do not have sittings, nor had committee meetings. We also had to ensure that within that space of time, we do not compromise on meeting the act in terms of accountability. So the executive, led by the secretary of the legislature and the CFO, ensured that they engage with the office of the AG and started the necessary submissions that were now done remotely, because the entire staff of the legislature was working remotely. But what needed to be done was done virtually and electronically. Now, as we moved forward, we came to, it was around March, April, around May, we usually have our start of sectoral parliaments. Already for March, April, we couldn't have some interfaith symposium, which is sectoral parliament and sectoral work. But in May, we decided that let's test as KwaZulu-Natal. And we were able to hold our first ever sectoral parliament that was virtual. And I like to believe that it was the first in the country. We had the Workers' Parliament and we were able to hold it virtually, and it was a success. So from there, as an institution, both political and administratively, we started to be bold. We started to go back fully and aggressively by ensuring that now we're going back to have sittings, but we're going back to have portfolio committee meetings. Because whilst government is dealing with COVID-19, there is another aspect that we shouldn't fail on, the oversight. We wanted the committees, especially the frontline committees, your education, human settlements, health, to be able to interact with the departments. And they did their meetings virtually. Nobody was coming to the institution. But we have also, besides that, called upon members to do public participation or public education in their constituencies. They were given the required pamphlets that they can do the public education without leaving their own homes, but ensuring that when they happen to have an opportunity to communicate, they communicate through their constituency offices. And we also changed how we make allowances for members to do their work, especially the ones that deal with e-connectivity. We changed that. We provided them with masks and sanitizers, and we also gave them to the sectors. We also gave the masks and sanitizers to the sectors to ensure that public education was able to reach other people. The entire business process of the institution was now done remotely. But when we reached level 2, the legislature was able to now start to have hybrid, which is what we are currently also having.
Madam Speaker, just to let you know, you have 1 minute remaining, please.
Then we moved from fully virtual to hybrid, and we are now having our sittings where other members come to the chamber and others don't. Our legislature is 80 members, but we are only having 46 that can come and be accommodated. We are continuing with public participation, and we have upped our use of social media, and we are doing a bill back to ensure that we reach our sectors and also reach the public. So that is how as KwaZulu-Natal we have tried to respond.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker. And absolutely, it's right that you say at the start that the position is slightly different as a provincial legislature, and as the CPA, one of our unique selling points is that we also engage with the subnational parliament. So we always like to have that perspective. So we're especially grateful for your contributions. And this idea of scenario planning, I think, is absolutely fantastic, and also very interesting to hear about how some of the rules need to be looked at in terms of how we deal with quite an unprecedented situation, and how tech can sort of be an answer to some of those issues, but also sort of raise their own issues. So needing to have rules around those as well. So thank you so much for your contributions. And it now gives me great pleasure to pass over to my colleague, Mr. Matthew Salek, Head of Parliamentary Development here at the CPA Secretariat. Matt, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hope you can all hear me okay. It's a great pleasure. Can you hear me?
We can, Matt. It's a little bit quiet, but we can hear you.
Okay, I shall speak up then. Well, it's a great pleasure to be on this panel with so many illustrious speakers, and I'll try to keep my comments relatively short to allow for more questions. A lot of the examples that were given today at this webinar, I think, were very positive examples of how effective parliaments have managed to adapt to COVID-19 and do so quite quickly and ensure and safeguard the well-being of their members and also and their staff, but also to ensure that Parliament could conduct its business within its mandate. But unfortunately, this story isn't always quite so positive in many jurisdictions around the Commonwealth. and the many jurisdictions that are represented in the regions represented here today. Some parliaments have limited finances. Their budgets are quite restricted. Governments limit the amount of money that the parliament gets, and therefore they don't necessarily have the resources to provide the IT infrastructure to sit in a hybrid format. They may not be able to have the ability to hire staff in sufficient numbers to be able to support IT provision or broadcasting, or enable the necessary provisional and procedural activities that may need to be undertaken. In a number of jurisdictions, staff of parliaments are not staff of the House of the Parliament, but are in fact civil servants who are seconded to work in those parliaments. And therefore, parliaments have to decide how much control they have over the well-being of staff to ensure that they're kept safe and well. But sometimes governments want staff to go back to work sooner than is perhaps safe. In other jurisdictions, there may be a lack of political will from the government to enable the parliament to function effectively. There may be a reluctance to ensure that there's sufficient oversight and scrutiny in parliament because to create committees, ad hoc committees, and although they have been created in a number of the jurisdictions represented here, that hasn't always been the case. And so why do some of these issues arise? Why are some of Parliament struggling with effectively adapting to this situation? Well, part of it, but not entirely, is because they fail to have the sufficient autonomy, independence, financial control, and the necessary administration and resources that they need to do so. And part of that problem stems from the fact that they don't have the necessary bodies in place in Parliament, such as a Parliamentary Commission, or in the case of Canada, the Board of Internal Economy, or in that case of the UK, the House of Commons Commission, to be able to provide that forum for parliaments to provide the effective control that they need to act quickly and without necessarily the will and the need of the government to accommodate those changes. Those institutions or corporate bodies are a very valuable mechanism to enable that change to take place. So with that in mind, the CPA in May of 2020 put together its model law for independent parliaments. The model law is designed to create a legislative template for Commonwealth parliaments to replicate in their jurisdictions to create corporate bodies and parliamentary commissions that have the powers and structures in place to enable parliaments to function effectively, particularly to give them the administrative, operational and financial resources they need to be able to adapt to crises like COVID. More importantly, they provide an effective forum of leadership for the Parliament, usually chaired by the Speaker of the Legislature, but also containing other leadership from the Parliament and government and opposition, who can give insight and guidance on how Parliament should be run effectively. The model law also seeks to highlight why it's in the interest of governments to ensure that such an institution is created, particularly because it can enable more accountability and more effective, quick, responsive behaviour. The model law also creates a roadmap for implementation, and it also is adaptive for the various styles of parliaments, both national and subnational, unicameral, bicameral. We also delivered this model law because over the last 2 years, the CPA has been working with many jurisdictions in terms of benchmark assessments. And in most of the reports that have come out of these assessments, a common denominator has arisen that many of these parliaments do not have effective independence and do not feel that they're able to have the necessary autonomy they need. So the model law was in an attempt to help reinforce that and to provide a tool for those parliaments to consider reform. But ultimately, COVID puts a spotlight on what are everyday institutional weaknesses, arguably, and an independent parliament with a strong leadership in the form of a commission, although is not a cure-all, but has the potential to ensure that parliaments can be more adaptive to such challenges in the future. I would say that that speakers should give serious consideration to examining the model law and to look internally and honestly at how their parliaments are administered and financed, and to make sure that they're able to effect change quickly. I think that in terms of COVID, that Parliament should undertake internal reviews and to identify lessons learned from this scenario, and to consider in a more distant perspective what could have been done differently, if at all. And taking on board the CPA benchmarks as a standard to which to compare with, but also, if there's an appetite for reform, to look at the model law as a mechanism to ensure that some change could be put in place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matt, for highlighting the work being done on the model law toolkit and the importance of really using it as a sort of reflective activity on behalf of the institutions. So thank you so much, and thank you so much on behalf of all attendees, really, to all the speakers for their presentations here today. It now gives me pleasure to open up the question and answer session. I know that we have a great number of speakers and presiding officers here with us as attendees, and as I say that, somebody has already put their hand up. I had a feeling that we wouldn't struggle to have questions from the floor. So I'll just invite, as a first question, it gives me great pleasure to invite the speaker, Angelo Farrugia of Malta, who was also our former small branches chairperson and another great friend of the CPA. Mr. Speaker, I'll invite you to speak to the panelists.
Thank you very much. I was following with great attention the speakers before me, especially what Matthew Panel said. And my question is the importance of parliamentary autonomy. In fact, Malta Parliament became fully autonomous in 2017. And my question is that following this experience of the COVID-19, which of course was very important to organize ourselves once we were completely autonomous and we could set up all the necessary apparatus, organization for COVID, etc. My question to the panel is whether they agree that once you have the full autonomy, you can organize yourself in even as was done during the COVID-19, and we're still doing it, technological advances, that we could make it more practical for our members to participate in meetings and conferences. In fact, Malta also held the BIMR recently, full conference, once it organized itself without being at the mercy of the executive to get the finances. And also the second question is whether they agree that Parliament, once it organizes itself fully autonomous, as we are, and of course other countries are, and hopefully that more legislators do become fully autonomous, can become more efficient, even to pass legislation in such urgent circumstances as the COVID-19. Thank you very much, and congratulations for the conference.
Sorry, James, we can't hear you.
Apologies. Can you hear me now? Perfect. And I'll just invite one more question from the floor for this round, and it comes from a Miss Rochelle Ford. So I'd invite you to put your question to the panel now. You should be able to speak. Yep.
My only question really is, I just wanted to know, coming from a fledgling democracy of our own, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we did not in any way suspend our sit-ins. But what, if any, were your major challenges technologically wise? I know some of the speakers spoke about having virtual sessions. How well did it work, as we tend to be a little bit afraid of things different as human beings. So I just wanted to know, how was that interaction? How was that? How did you adapt to that lack of face-to-face, one-on-one type of interaction in your parliamentary debates and proceedings?
Thank you so much, Ms. Ford, for your question also. I'll take those two in combination with one that came in through the chat, which was regarding the success of the hybrid model that some of our speakers presented on. Specifically, the question was whether panelists think the hybrid model or the option of members attending the chamber will continue once the pandemic is over. I'll invite panelists to decide how they want to interpret that, whether it's that they think it will continue or whether they think it should continue. But I'll also include that question in this round of questioning. And if I could first go to the Honourable Speaker Rota for his thoughts, and Mr. Speaker, I'll allow you to take questions in turn, however you see fit, in whichever order you see fit.
Very good, thank you, James. The question from Speaker Farrugia, regarding the autonomy of Parliament, it's essential. In Canada, as was mentioned earlier, we do have the Board of Internal Economy, which is a panel or a board of members from all parties who come together and make decisions based on what the finances are and what the needs are. And without that independence, we would have had a very difficult time making decisions and getting things approved because of the urgency of what was going on, to make sure that we could step into things. And if I could just kind of shift into Ms. Ford's comments about the challenges, a lot of the decisions that were made regarding technology and how we could attack it. One of the things that we did initially was we had a representative group come to Parliament, and it was by proxy. So we had, I believe it was no more than 26 or 30 members in the chamber, and they all represented their parties. Now, the way the Canadian rules are is that you can only have, you cannot stop someone from coming in. So the invitation went out to all members. As Speaker, you cannot prevent someone from coming in. What you can do is work out with everyone so that everything is agreed on beforehand, and everyone stuck to their own their numbers, and it worked out rather well, where they made that decision on how many people were in the room, and they represented their parties more than they represented the individuals, which was a compromise on behalf of all members, but it was a way of coming to a decision. One of the decisions that we decided on was, rather than have Parliament, because it was suspended, we would have a virtual COVID-19 committee, which I chaired, and it was completely virtual. We had people coming in from Canada, and as you know, Canada is quite a bit larger than most countries. It's quite the expanse, and to have everyone come in at once and actually to manage it was a challenge at first, but people got used to it, and it worked out rather well. The COVID committee and eventually turned into a virtual Parliament. There are actually a hybrid Parliament where we have up to 80 members in the chamber, and the rest are from home. In front of my seat, I have two monitors, and actually three monitors, one that's normally there giving me the information of what's going on in the House, but the other two are giving me information on who wants to speak and who is speaking at the time, and who's up next. So it really is high tech, and again, coming to autonomy, we were able to hire people and shift staff around so that it worked for us, where if someone wants to speak or has a point of order, in the House, you can stand up and it's easy. On virtual, you have to use the raised hand function, which the speaker has to have in front of him and in front of him or her, so that they can actually see it come up. And it has been working fairly well. One of the things that we do a little bit differently is our votes, where every member has to be in the House, as was mentioned earlier. It's the same in the legislature in Canada. So we had to make that change. But with the votes, when someone's name is called, they stand and they vote the way they see fit, either for or against or abstain. Now, when we did it virtually or hybrid, those who were in the chamber voted normally, and those who were away had to vote, and their names were called, and they are virtual, where we had to see their face on the screen and we had to hear their voice. So we had a confirmation, and that's been working out fairly well. I mean, it takes a little bit longer than we normally do. Normally it takes about 12 minutes of vote to 15 minutes of vote. We're around 30 minutes of vote. So it is taking a little bit longer, and it is efficient, and it is working, and that's something that has been going well. One of the questions that I believe was asked by Speaker Cooper from Alberta was, do we plan on continuing this? That's something for the chamber, and the chamber has been, the members of the House have been very good at cooperating when it came to hard decisions. Politics seemed to have left for a short while, and they were actually down to making decisions based on facts and what's best for Canadians and parliamentarians, which was very heartwarming as a speaker. But some of the things that have come up is people participating virtually, and it's been suggested for someone who is ill and can't make it to the House, or someone who is on maternity leave. These are all things that can be considered down the road, but they're not being decided on now. But it'll certainly be some interesting discussions coming down the road. Now, I could go on for hours, so I'll let someone else continue, and I know we're limited for time. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker Rota. I'll now pass on to Madam Speaker, Honourable Annisette-George. I know that you mentioned in your presentations that it's sort of in terms of practice in the chamber, you've not necessarily done so much virtual or hybrid procedures, but that you've explored it. So maybe from that angle, if you'd like to contribute something in answer to the questions put forward.
So thank you, James. So as I said, we have explored the technology, and I've actually tested it. We've looked to the Brazilian legislature for guidance because it's well established there. So we do have the capability of doing it either virtually, completely, or hybrid. We have had some technological challenges in seeing how the hybrid would work. The voting system, which we've explored, mirrors precisely what was explained by Speaker Rota, and the technology allows for it. We have done the committee meetings virtually though, and you know, members, of course, it takes time to get accustomed. We've circulated before, and we've done some training with protocols. So, you know, the raising of the hands, using the icon there when you need to speak. We know how to separate people into rooms. And in fact, if we had to do a virtual, one of the issues were how do you enforce the standing orders if somebody has committed a breach. And we've realized the technology allows you to put the person into a room. Okay, so just as a speaker had the power to have a member withdraw from sitting in the chamber or taking their seat, the technology allows for it. So, you know, we feel pretty confident that if we had to go virtual, it is something that our members, having done the tests through the committee system, because our committees continue to be done virtually, should be very comfortable in making the adjustment.
Many thanks, Madam Speaker. I'll now pass on. I understand the Right Honourable Deputy Speaker, Dame Laing, you may not be able to join us for the entirety of the Q&A. I hope that you are, but I understand you have a very busy schedule right now. So I'll just invite you to speak to any of the questions put forward so far.
Oh, excuse me. Thank you very much. I'll try not to rush away because it's fascinating hearing what everyone is saying, and it looks to me as if the Chancellor of the Exchequer is still on his feet, so I can stay a little while longer. It really is interesting to hear what everybody is saying. First of all, Rochelle Ford asked about new technology and how it was received, how it worked. A lot of people were very skeptical when we first started to do this hybrid system, where some people were present in the chamber and some people were coming in on these giant screens. And it slowed things down and it took away the spontaneity. But actually, isn't it amazing how we adapt to whatever is thrown at us? We are adaptive people. That's what human beings are. And politicians are very adaptive. You recognize a new system, a new situation, and you simply have to go with it. And it's amazing how we've got used to it. And this is another example. Here we are. We should be having the CPA conference in some lovely place on one of your really nice islands in the sun somewhere, and it would have been a great pleasure to come and meet you all, and very exciting. But here we are sitting here doing the discussion. So as with everything else, we lose the human interaction part. We lose the spontaneity, and today we are losing the conversations that we might have had after this session, but we are able to do the basic business. And I think that all of our parliaments have actually shown a great example and leadership to the rest of the community about how we keep on going. Fascinating to hear how some of you have dealt with the virtual proceedings. We have dealt with it by the introduction of lists. Now, this is today's list. I'm showing you here the statement for the Chancellor of the Exchequer. There are on the list, the statement is expected to last about 2.5 hours, and it goes from that page to that page to that page to that page. There are 90 people on this list. Now, normally the speaker would just choose at random. Once you've done the obvious, well, you all know what it's like. You go to the senior members, former chancellors of the Exchequer, etc. first. Then after about the first 10, you choose whoever catches your eye, literally whoever catches your eye and is standing up. Well, we can't do that because we can't have 90 people in the chamber. And of these 90 people, about 35 or so are coming in virtually. So we know, it says on this list, whether it is virtual or physical. And so the person in the chair knows that you're going over to someone who's coming in virtually. So we have a clerk sitting beside the chair with headphones on, communicating with our broadcasting department, who says, yes, that member is ready and the link is up. And then we just activate it and go to that person virtually. So instead of everybody standing there for 2 hours, everybody sitting for 2 hours and jumping up when they want to ask a question, they know when they're going to come in. So if you're number 81, you can't and don't go in at the beginning. You have to watch it on TV in your office and then come in when you can. We also have different voting systems. I explained before that instead of all crowding in at the same moment, it's been arranged so that there are fewer people there in person. Originally, for the first few months, we had electronic voting where people could vote from their phones. But we stopped that as soon as we could, when we could get enough people back here to participate in divisions. But then people who choose to vote at the moment, as I said earlier, about 400 people currently choose to vote by proxy, either because they don't want to be here or because they think it's safer for them not to be here. Although you can now speak in the chamber but not vote, because it's up to each person to make their risk assessment. Sitting in the chamber means that you are 2 meters away from everyone else. So it is relatively safe. And our chamber, as I said earlier, is enormous and the flow of air through it is very, very good. So it's not dangerous to be in the chamber. It is dangerous if you're worried about being susceptible to the virus, to be in a long queue of members who start off being 2 meters apart, but unfortunately, the discipline gets lost. There's a surprise. A bunch of MPs together where the discipline gets lost. Oh.
Many thanks, Madam Deputy. I'm just conscious of bringing in the perspective from KwaZulu-Natal, but very, very
I want to hear that too, so I will conclude very quickly by saying two things. The first is that you asked about whether this hybrid model should continue once the pandemic is past. My personal opinion is absolutely not. Absolutely not, because the atmosphere of Parliament as a debating chamber, as a parliament, a place where people talk to each other, is lost. And so I'm totally against it. And finally, it's been interesting to hear that some parliaments don't have a corporate body which represents Parliament and can, let's face it, stand up to the government on behalf of Parliament. We have a very strong commission here in the House of Commons, and I'm quite sure that through the good offices of the CPA, what Matthew Selleck said about producing the, what did you call it, the you said
model law.
Model law, that's it, I couldn't find my note. A model law. I hope that we might be able to be helpful in telling you through the CPA and Matthew's work on the model law what happens here in the UK, because it works quite well. Thank you.
Many thanks, Madam Deputy Speaker. And interestingly, I think on the TV behind you, somebody was joining virtually. So we saw it in practice. I had a screen on my screen,
there we are.
which is quite interesting. So I'd just like to bring in the perspective from KwaZulu-Natal, from the Honourable Madam Speaker Boyce.
Thank you, Jim. For us, I will start with the one about how do we find the challenges. For us, the challenges were due to access initially. And we dealt with that by providing the service providers, ensuring that the same service provider must also provide boosters, network signal boosters in the areas that we're in. But by so doing, then the community began to also benefit. So the signal was improved. But also to deal with our challenges, because the entire business process was now done remotely. The team, the administration of the legislature launched an app. KwaZulu-Natal legislature had to have its own app that is also found on the Play Store, where all our meetings and diary and everything is put together. And at the press of a button, we were now like parliaments that have been already there in the remote world. We already could come in, and that assisted a lot. Now, the other issue in terms of voting, we agreed as parties before we go to vote, because we have passed the bills and everything, we agreed that on what mode of voting we will do. When we're using party votes, which my colleagues are calling proxy votes, but also allow for individual vote per member. That we do, and we allow members and call out members to come and do individual votes, and it is working fine. How do I see it in the future? Honestly, my own view is that hybrid parliaments should be the parliaments of the future. Let's take about cases of people that are in parliament and are still at a childbearing stage. They want to be with their families, but they are important discussions that they want to be part of. They can be, if they are allowed to do hybrid, but also when you are also not well, you can also participate. You don't get left out for as long as we are still able. So where I'm seated, I think that a hybrid parliament should be the parliaments of the future, even beyond this. The other part that we also think that as we move forward in doing is that whilst it removed the human element and the spontaneity, but it also increased in our own case, the party-to-party relations. You find that parties are now agreeing more on what is the common purpose for the province and for the country, more than what is it that my party wants to achieve. They are now moving together into agreements. And I found that as a plus and a benefit for us as a legislature. And also when I look during the parliament sittings at a national level, I see that parties are moving together towards that. Thank you, James.
Many thanks, Madam Speaker Boyce, for your answers, and many thanks to all the other panelists for their contributions. I am conscious of time. I think there may be enough time for one, possibly two more questions from the attendees. I don't see any hands now, but we have a lot of speakers and deputy speakers in this. I'm sure nobody's too shy to put forward any questions. I'm not seeing any at this stage, so I think in that case, if I can invite you, Stephen, to give some short closing remarks, that'd be fantastic. And who knows, maybe we'll get one or two more questions as you're delivering those.
James, thank you very much. And can I first of all thank the team from the Secretariat, James, who has compared admirably, Matt, who spoke to us, Jack, and the rest of the programme's team, and then to just give on all our behalves warm thanks to our panel of esteemed speakers and deputy speakers who've spoken and discussed today. Let me echo the remarks that James made at the beginning in memory of the late Deputy Speaker of KwaZulu-Natal, and to say that all of our thoughts are with the late Deputy Speaker's family for their loss at this difficult time. COVID has been an enormous challenge for parliaments across the world, obviously across the Commonwealth. It has a tragedy of loss of life, people losing their loved ones, people who are still living with COVID today, but also has this great impact on our economies and on our societies that's going to take a long time for us to build back from. But I have been very struck, both during this seminar, but also in the 3.5 months now that I've been in this role, at how fast parliaments have adapted to this crisis. And all of our speakers today have demonstrated that. Let me mention a few. Speaker Rota, who is our president of the CPA, speaking, I think, rightly about the importance of maintaining public confidence through a crisis like this one. Speaker Annisette-George, who served with distinction on our executive committee, and I thank her for that service. And she talked about a number of things, including the opportunity to still engage with young people in Trinidad and Tobago using virtual platforms to maintain that engagement. My good friend, the Deputy Speaker of the House of Commons, Eleanor Laing, it's lovely to see you, Eleanor, albeit virtually. I think one of the things you said was about the sweeping powers that governments have taken to themselves during this crisis in countries across the Commonwealth, and the absolute importance of accountability, scrutiny and oversight. And then, of course, Speaker Boyce, who made that important point that for provincial parliaments, some of the challenges are the same, but some of them are different, reminding us about the digital divide. We can get very excited about these new platforms, but accessibility isn't the same everywhere, and we need to address that. And I think your final point about cross-party working, I found a fascinating point and a very uplifting point, that perhaps in a crisis, some of the traditional adversarial politics might be put to one side in the wider public or national interest. Let me draw together 4 main points, if that is okay, James. The first is the one really that Matthew made and that others have affirmed, the vital importance of strong, independent parliaments. It's always important, but in a crisis, it's even more important. And the model law, ensuring the resources are there, ensuring the systems are there, vitally important. Secondly, the point around some of these emergency powers. Parliaments do come together in a crisis and tend to give governments what they want. There is a risk that after the crisis, some of these emergency powers stay on the statute book. So one of the issues for parliaments is to review the powers, to look at the legislation with post-legislative scrutiny, ideally to have time limits on these powers so that they are able to not continue once the crisis is over. Thirdly, I think we need to be thinking about preparedness for any future crises. Let us hope there isn't another pandemic like this, but there could be. Let us hope there isn't a major other sort of incident, but there could be. And one of the things from a crisis period is that we can learn lessons about what has worked, what hasn't worked so well, and be ready as parliaments to deal with that in the future. And finally, and probably the issue, understandably, that's had the greatest focus today, is the way in which parliaments have adapted their modalities to this crisis. I mean, I recall, and Eleanor will remember this, that we used to have a select committee on the modernisation of the House of Commons 20 years ago, and it looked at things like, could you have electronic voting? Could you have lists of speakers? All of those sorts of things were considered back then, but in a crisis, countries and parliaments are made to make decisions that perhaps they weren't able to make before. Now, clearly there'll be a debate about how far this continues. We've heard different views from our speakers and deputy speakers about whether a hybrid or virtual model is something that should survive this crisis. But I certainly hope through the CPA, as well as in individual parliaments, we can look at the evidence and learn about what is best. And it may well be that elements of hybridity could be retained. I think perhaps, for example, for committees, when they're taking evidence, to feel more confident, to take expert evidence from people down the line, rather than everyone having to travel to the Parliament in order to give that evidence, and possibly for engagement with citizens, things like the youth engagement that we heard about from Speaker Annisette-George. But look, really grateful to everyone who's given their time to be with us today. This is the second of these that we've done. Really rich, full discussion. There's a lot of lessons for us to learn together, and I just look forward to working with all of you. And hopefully at some time, rather than sitting at home, as I am now, that I might be in Trinidad and Tobago, I might be in KwaZulu-Natal, and certainly in Canada next year, where we very much look forward to being in Nova Scotia next August for our Commonwealth Parliamentarians Conference. It'd be wonderful to have as many of the participants from today as part of that conference in Canada next August. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And I don't see any more questions from the floor. So I think we're finishing almost perfectly on time. So you can tell that we're in a session full of presiding officers. We've stuck to time a little, quite well. So in view of no further questions, I'll just echo Stephen saying thank you so much to all the panelists for taking time out of what I'm sure are very busy schedules. Equally to everybody who's attended as audience members. I'm sure your schedules are just as busy. So thank you so much for joining us. And just to reiterate what I said at the very beginning, that we at the CPA look forward to working more with speakers and presiding officers going forward. You are a key stakeholder in everything we do. So we look forward to that, and to echo what's been said by, I think, everybody at this point, that hopefully, whilst we'll have many more sessions like this, some of that future collaboration will be in person, including in Nova Scotia. So I'll just say thank you for joining, and we'll draw it to an end there. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.